My name is Dr. Brown, Robert S. Brown. I'm a psychiatrist at Fort Lee. For the last decade, I've been working with soldiers coming back from combat with various forms of psychological conditions. Let me say that I think most of these conditions can be helped a lot, but we're still puzzling over the best ways of understanding and treating these conditions. You know, we've deployed over 2.5 million people. And at first we thought maybe somewhere around 15% would come back with PTSD. The estimates now are as high as 40% will have some kind of significant psychological problem. Perhaps PTSD or major depression or a combination or substance abuse, some major problem. Now I'm going to introduce some concepts that may sound a little strange and far-fetched, but I've been using these concepts successfully for 10 years. And it's a combination of what is called object relations theory and attachment theory. It's an interesting way of explaining interpersonal relationships. How is it that we come to be able to relate to some people effectively and successfully and in a sustained way, and not being able to relate at all to other people? So I've entitled this Posttraumatic Psychological Rebirth. And I'm going to talk about severe combat trauma stress and the sense of self. I'm going to talk about moderate and chronic combat stress and the sense of self, the experience of the sense of self, the origin of the sense of self, and contemporary and consistency in the sense of self. So the first topic then is the origin of the sense of self. Let me divert just for a moment and say that following World War II, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby was asked to study the problem of so many orphans, children whose parents had been killed in combat in World War II, whose parents, many of them were killed in the civilian sector as well. And these children were often sent out into the country to a safe place during the bombing of London, and they were spared, but their parents did not make it in many cases. So it gave an interesting challenge to try to understand how these children could fare without their parents. Now, some of them in other countries, where there were very numerous orphans, did not do well at all. Some of them were left lying in their cribs for years and could not even walk at 5 or 6 years of age. But when they were picked up, even by mentally retarded children, older children, to take care of their needs, changing diapers and holding them and loving them, they began to grow and they began to walk and talk. So there's something about developing a sense of being cared for that made a difference. The sense of self that we all begin with is a sense of our body. The mothering person, and I'm using the mothering person instead of just the mother, because anyone can be the mothering person as long as a consistent relationship. The mothering person, in caring for the child, the infant, loving it, touching it, wooing to it, and meeting all of its needs, is carving out the child's sense of itself. The mothering person has been called the Master Sculptor. By holding the child, touching the child, rubbing the legs, hands, teeth, whatever the child has at that stage in life, the child comes to like and love itself and develops an image in its own mind, an internalized image of the body first. And on that template is built later the sense of who they are as a person. An infant's body is touched and the body image is formed. Now, there's good mothering and not good enough mothering. And I had a chance to have lunch one day with Mary Ainsworth, who was a psychologist who studied with Dr. Bowlby in 1950 for a number of years before she went off to Africa to study children herself. And she developed a fascinating experimental way to observe infants and small children. And it's called the strange situation. The mother brings the child in, and the child is allowed to explore the room, and then a stranger enters the room and talks to the mother, and then the mother leaves. And the child's reaction to the mother leaving, and then after a few minutes, the child's reactions to the mother returning, is this experimental paradigm to observe these children. And it was fascinating that she was able to find two very distinct styles of reacting to the stranger. First, some children screamed and cried and protested when the mother left, would not interact at all with the stranger. And then when the mother came back, there was a reunion of happiness and hugging and being pleased. And then there were children who showed no emotion whatsoever when the mother left, when the stranger began to talk to the child, and no happiness or anything when the mother returned. So she then went into the homes of these children to observe what kind of reaction the child and the mother had together. And she noted the children who cried and protested when the mother left came from a good mother home. That's where the mothering person was in tune with the child's needs. If the child was hungry, the mother would allow it to be fed at its own pace. If the child was playing on the floor, the child continues to play on the floor at its own pace. But in the other home, where the children did not show any emotion, the child was able to not interact in a smooth way at all with the mother. The mother would jam food in its mouth when it was unexpecting it, snap it up off the floor, and had no sense or no appreciation of the child's timing. So right away, she was able to tell that certainly the way the mother and the infant interacted determined how the child was going to develop. Now, I asked her when I had lunch with her how she could account for this, and she said there were a lot of factors involved, but even by a year or two of age, the child had learned that crying and screaming would have no effect on the mother. But she did report that the blood pressure, the pulse, the breathing rate, all was accelerated in these children. And even though they weren't crying for help, inside their bodies, they were under a great deal of stress. Now, observations were made over a period of months, even years. It turns out that by early in life, the child has a style of being attached, first to the mother and then to other people. And this attachment style can be of several types. It is certainly strongly influenced by the mothering person. It's also influenced by the family security, by economic factors, by health of the family members, and by separation from the family, which is very critical. But there were several attachment styles that were developed that she could describe. One was the secure attachment, where the child, from childhood on, seemed to be relatively secure in itself, could play about and explore things and move into the community with some confidence. There was the ambivalent attachment style, where the child had a mixture of being frightened and being uncertain. There was the avoidant style, where the child just simply did not interact at all with other children or with people in general. And then the final was the disorganized style of attachment. Now, I'm repeating some of this that I mentioned in a previous lecture because I think there's a similarity between what soldiers go through in severe combat situations and what children go through in their psychological birth. So, attachment styles are primarily permanent with notable exceptions. And these are some of the exceptions that will change a person's attachment style. So what I'm saying is that by the time you are 4, 5, or 6 years of age, you have developed a style of attaching which is fixed for the rest of your life, unless some of these things happen. You have a major chronic illness, you have overwhelming stress, you have major losses or major injuries. In other words, soldiers could be very likely a candidate for these kinds of problems. Let's talk now about the origin of the sense of the soldier as a self. How do soldiers become identified within themselves as soldiers? I think there's a family influence. In some cases, there are multi-generations where father and son have been in the military. Also, in the enlistment process, attachments begin. In training, attachments continue. In combat, there is stronger attachments. And in deployment, there is significant attachment. Why do you think attachment is so important? Well, it's important to the infant because they could not survive without it. Without being attached to the mothering person, no infant would survive more than a few weeks at the most, perhaps only a few days. What about soldiers? Without meaningful attachments, they could not survive combat without these secure, meaningful attachments. I'm going to try to make this clear by giving you a case history. This involves a soldier who's 32 years of age, divorced. He's an E6. He's been deployed several times. And in his first deployment to Iraq in 2003, he was on the recovery team. His job was to go out and get vehicles that had been damaged and return them to some holding point for them later to be assessed to decide, to be determined whether they should be maintained, repaired, or thrown away. When he was recovering one vehicle that had some body parts remaining in it and some blood, he discovered that it was the vehicle that his two best friends were in when they were killed. Well, he became profoundly depressed. In some ways, it was like an amputation, because to put this in physical terms, it was a real significant, serious ripping away of a close, perfected friendship, really, that his survival depended upon. Became depressed. His attachment style changed. He had been an outgoing person, friendly and happy, relatively happy, and he became an avoidant person. His attachment style became one of avoiding people. It was a transformation, in other words, in the very roots of his origin, first as a person and then as a soldier. And not long after that, he was overwhelmed by the feeling that no one cared for him. In other words, he became like an orphan, without parents, or without significant, strong attachment figures, like his battle buddies. And he took a massive overdose. He was unconscious for 24 hours. He was flown out of Iraq to Germany and finally back to Walter Reed, where he stayed for a month or two. And over time, he slowly got better. And then something unusual happened. He was back at his base, and he had been redeployed, and he was traveling on one of the highways in the state of his, where he was stationed, and he saw a car on fire on the side of the road. And two men were watching the burning car, but he stopped. He saw the driver was still in the car. He jumped out, ran, pulled this man from behind the steering wheel, dragged him about 100 feet away from the car, so if it blew up, he would not be injured further. Called 911, started CPR. The man looked at him and tried to say something and died. Then he became very depressed again, and even more avoidant now, and took a second overdose. Well, what is the relevance of a case like this to the topic we're discovering now? We're discussing now. It's also a discovery in a way. The meaningful relationships he had with his battle buddies had been destroyed in a vehicle. He was unaware of the significance of this because I thought what he had done was heroic. The two men who watched the vehicle burn did nothing. He did everything humanly possible, but he felt like an utter failure. In other words, he was mixing the two traumas together. It's almost like radiation. You get some today and some tomorrow. It adds up, and it's more radiation than you can handle. Some stress today, some stress tomorrow, especially if there's similarities in the stressors, then you reach your boiling point and you spill over. Well, I've tried to help him see this, and he hasn't seen it. Cognitively, he doesn't see the relationship, the connection between the two losses, the vehicle with his friend's death and the vehicle with a total stranger. And I pointed out to him that while he did not save the man's life, he saved his body, which is very important to the family of this man who was killed in a car wreck. That didn't make much difference. He lives alone. He rarely came out of his house except to be an instructor, and had no friends. He declared that he would never make another close friendship because it was simply too painful to lose a friend. Now, these are more than friends now, because these are people upon whom his very life depended. And so it was more than that. As I said, it was like an amputation, 2 amputations, without anesthesia, followed by depression and avoidance style, attachment style change. So, with a lot of encouragement, he agreed to come into group therapy. In the first group, he told his story, but as minimally as he possibly could tell it. One soldier right away said, "Let me give you my cell number. I want you to call me if you're willing to talk. I want to talk to you. My heart's going out to you." He didn't call that man. So that was in the traumatic grief group that meets once a week. So then I was able to get him to come into a depression group because he's profoundly depressed. He came there, would not say anything at all. Again, not wanting to become attached to anybody. He took out his cell phone, and I was a little bit offended because I thought, gee, I'm doing everything I can to help you, and you're just going to play with your cell phone? And so I said, "What are you doing?" And he passed me a cell phone that he had written a message to me saying, "I don't want to become attached to anybody anymore." He couldn't even say it to the group. He said it to me in a text message that he passed to me. So we let that go. The second week he came back, and the other group members were reaching out to him, and he seemed to be a little more responsive. As a matter of fact, he showed some real feeling, and he even cried and said nobody cared for him. No one sent him anything while he was deployed both times. No one calls him now. He just lives alone, and nobody cares for him. Well, I saw him the next day and this week in an individual session, and he said that several members of the group had taken him out to dinner after the group meeting, had paid for his meal, and drove him back to his car. And he was feeling better. In other words, this man who had lost, he thought, everything, certainly his closest attachment figures, is now beginning to open up a little bit and to let us become mothering persons to him again. And to do that, we have to be trustworthy and predictable. No surprises for these people who are so vulnerable. And his sense of self now is going to have to be in the same way that the mother carved the image of a lovable person. In the group and individual therapy, we're trying to carve an image in his mind now that he is someone of value. Certainly he's been of value to the family that will never know him for saving that man's body at the risk of his own life. He won't be known by the people that he lost in their families. He's never had contact with their families, his best friends, and at some point we're hopeful he'll be able to contact the parents or the family members of the 2 best friends he had in combat and let them know that he was very upset and continues to be over their death now, all these years later, just about 12 years later. So there is a part of the mind that has no sense of time when it comes to dealing with trauma. And the psychological rebirth is going to happen with this man with consistent demonstration of honest caring for him. So to summarize this, many soldiers are coming back with combat trauma-related injuries. These are emotional injuries. They're no less important, no less painful than physical injuries. They have to be reborn again. They have to rediscover the sense of who they were before they were traumatized, before their sense of themselves as soldiers and as people was destroyed in combat. So that's the model that I'm holding out to you today. Ask yourself, what is your attachment style now? Have you become avoidant or disorganized even? Have you tried to deal with your trauma memories by not remembering them, by not talking about them, by avoiding anything related to trauma, including treatment? If that's the case, you need to go to a qualified provider and find a way of learning to trust that provider so that you can share your trauma and begin the psychological rebirth process again. I hope this will stimulate some thinking on your part. And that's the purpose of these videotapes, is to stir up your thinking so that you'll become motivated to be born again in that sense. Thank you very much and good luck.